We have a quorum now. You want to home right now?
Yeah, we just. Yeah.
Oh, that's for fiscal week. Okay. Does he have one?
I can return those email
Oh.
and I sent him a text.
Yeah. Oh, she knows. Madam Chair, we currently have a quorum.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. At this time, I'd like to call to order the April 20th, 2023 regular board meeting of the North County Transit District. And before we begin, I just want to make a quick announcement. There is an incident on the 5, and so that's why some of our board members are delayed. So since we have quorum, we're starting, but I just want you to know I'm stepping in for the chair right now as the vice chair, and then once she's here, she'll take back over. So members of the public who may be viewing the meeting on the district's YouTube page, please note that in order to make a public comment during the meeting, you must connect to the meeting using the Zoom link provided on the agenda. In addition, you must also register by sending an email containing your name or phone number and the agenda item for which you want to speak on to clerk@nctd.org. So I will now ask Sahil Rodriguez, clerk of the board, to call the roll.
Board Member Weiss. Board Member Hensy. Board Member Contreras.
Present.
Board Member White. Board Member Desmond.
Here.
Board Member Drucker. Board Chair Edson. Board Member Jenkins. Vice Chair Bapatel.
Here.
That completes my role.
Thank you. And Board Member Jenkins, will you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? Thank you. Sahil, are there any changes to the agenda?
Yes, Madam Chair. The agenda document was modified to reflect that agenda item number 12 was moved to consent. The revised agenda was sent to the board and it has been updated on NCTD website.
Great, thank you. And I was remiss in saying that I know you need to provide a safety brief and review evacuation procedures as well. Thank you.
I will do that now. In case of an emergency, I will dial 911. In case of an evacuation, please take the stairs. Do not use the elevators. Once cleared of the building, do not re-enter unless cleared to do so by emergency personnel. There are fire extinguishers and first aid kits on each floor of the building. There is a portable defibrillator on the first floor and staff on hand trained on CPR procedures if needed. This concludes my safety brief.
Great, thank you. And do we have any public comments today?
A public comment was received this morning for general public comment. This was also sent to the board ahead of the meeting and posted to the NCTD website.
Okay, great. And no other speakers at this time?
No, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. So at this time, public registration to provide general public comments will end. And before we proceed, I have a couple of quick protocol items to share. First, I ask that our board members please hold your comments and questions until after each agenda item has been presented. And second, when the time comes for board members' questions or comments, if you could raise your hand and wait until you are called upon to speak. So the first item on our agenda is an update on state legislative efforts that are currently impacting transit. And Chris Orlando, our Chief Planning and Communications Officer, and Mary Dover, Governmental Affairs Officer, will be presenting this item. And I believe we also have Michael, is it Pimentel? Okay, Pimentel, Executive Director of the California Transit Association, joining us via Zoom. Welcome, Michael, and you have our attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Patel. Glad to be here, board members. First slide, please. As the board knows, we adopt the legislative platform for NCTD in the fall of each year. So we thought this would be a good juncture as the legislatures are in full swing to come back with an update with some issues and legislation impacting NCTD. So we wanted to do that today. First, a bit of an overview about our legislative program. NCTD actively participates in both the American Public Transit Association's Legislative Advocacy Day, as well as the California Transportation Association's federal and state legislative committees. We attend their federal and state legislative conferences as well. And we also participate in a regional infrastructure coordination working group that holds meetings each month with the governmental bodies from around the region who coordinate legislative activities. You find in your monthly board packet an update of the legislation we're tracking, as well as just general government updates that we provide to the board each month. But we wanted to do today is provide you an update on some key legislation that is impacting transit. We'll start with an overview of AB 181, which was passed last year regarding school bus transportation. We've had a lot of questions from board members about that, so wanted to give you an update on that legislation. And then we're very happy to have Michael Pimentel, who is the Executive Director of the California Transit Association, who will be here today to give us an update on other issues impacting transit. So Michael's joining us by Zoom. But first, Mary Dover, our Governmental Affairs Officer, will provide the update on AB 181.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, as Chris mentioned, although this piece of legislation doesn't have direct impacts on NCTD, we are working with our school district partners on the implementation of this legislation. So it was signed by Governor Newsom on June 30th of last year. The bill, it's called the Education Omnibus. So it's kind of a conglomerate of a lot of education legislation. It appropriated some additional funding for school districts. And as a condition to receive this funding, the local educational agency must develop a transportation plan, and that must be in coordination with transit agencies and other stakeholders. So as school districts are implementing this legislation, NCTD has met with a variety of school districts throughout the service area to coordinate with them on the development of their transportation plans. So available for any questions on that after I will turn to Michael Pimentel to give an overview of the fiscal cliff that some transit agencies are facing, the Transportation Development Act reform efforts, and free fare legislation. Michael, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Mary and Vice Chair Patel, directors. I do want to start off by just thanking you for the opportunity to be before you today and to present to you an update on a variety of aspects of the work program that we are overseeing as your California Transit Association. As Chris Orlando had noted, we have strong participation by NCTD in the various facets of our work as an association, including those two standing committees that were referenced, both our state and federal legislative committee. For both of those, we have representation through Mary Dover and Chris Orlando, respectively. And so as I lead into today's discussion, I do want to provide you with an update on work that is happening under the budget process, also work that is going on under the traditional legislative process. And I do want to begin, as we turn to this next slide, by providing an update on our pursuit as an association to secure new funding resources for California transit agencies to address significant operations funding shortfalls, which some in our membership are calling a fiscal cliff. And so the start of our work really began with a survey that we released to our association membership at the start of 2023. We'd been hearing toward the end of 2022 that many agencies were going to be facing some significant funding shortfalls in future fiscal years, and we wanted to get a clearer sense of what it is that we would be experiencing as an industry statewide. Now, on your screen, you'll see that one of the chief questions that we asked our association membership was, in which state fiscal year would your agency face the depletion of federal COVID-19 relief funds? And we had asked that question because for many agencies, when they reach their fiscal cliff is tied inextricably with when they will deplete their federal relief dollars. And so here you'll see that roughly 46% of our association members were projecting to fully expend their fiscal relief in fiscal year 23-24. There's another balance that would be facing the depletion of their relief in fiscal year 24-25. And then I do want to call out, there's this other category. That other category speaks to agencies who largely were scheduled to deplete their resources in fiscal year 22-23. And why that is important is, as we turn to the next slide, you will see that as agencies deplete those resources, that is when the operating deficits, the funding shortfalls begin. Here you'll see that for many agencies, the increase in that operating deficit is really in fiscal year 24-25, and that aligns with the depletion of funds in fiscal year 23-24. Now, we've estimated across our membership that we have a need over the next 5 fiscal years, taking us out toward fiscal year 27-28, of over $6 billion. And I want to note for you very carefully that while we have honed in on this presentation on specifically the interconnection between the depletion of federal relief dollars and the start of these funding shortfalls, there are a variety of factors that are putting agencies in this financial position. Here, I would note for you, of course, there is that stagnation in ridership levels. That, of course, has decreased the fare revenue collection by agencies across the state. For those heavily fare box dependent agencies like BART in the San Francisco Bay Area, Caltrain in the San Francisco Bay Area, and Metrolink in Southern California, that means that they're facing particularly acute challenges in these near fiscal years. But as we take a scan of agencies statewide, we also see that there are some significant cost pressures that our agencies are facing. Higher capital costs that are largely the result of supply chain issues that have frankly driven up the cost of procuring capital assets, doing construction, as well as high costs of operations that are largely the result of a tight labor market that has increased the costs of retaining and hiring workers, and that is creating a challenge on operating budgets. The other thing that we are seeing is that, much like everyday Californians, California transit agencies have experienced the cost of fuel increase fairly significantly, as we have seen supply shocks to the pipeline for diesel and for compressed natural gas. And then for many other agencies, though it is more in evidence in those out years, there is an expectation that there will be an economic downturn. And so for those agencies that are heavily dependent on sales tax revenue and local option sales taxes, that's where we start to see an increase in some of those out years in the projected operating deficits. So as I turn to the next slide, I do want to just highlight for you that as we have been scoping this issue as an association, we want to be very mindful of the state of California's own fiscal outlook. And here in January, Governor Newsom had released his proposed budget for fiscal year 23-24, which included a projection of a $22.5 billion deficit. We understand from our conversations with stakeholders in the governor's administration, in the legislature, that come the release of his May revise, which typically happens on May 15th, that deficit for the state will only grow. And so that has then focused our conversation within our association on budget conscious solutions for addressing that $6 billion in need. Much of what we are focused on today is looking to enact flexibility in existing transit funding sources. We have a variety of programs that provide significant funding to agencies for building out capital projects. There are less significant programs that provide operational funding support. And so we are discussing internally bringing online some flexibility that is authorized at a regional or local level to allow for agencies to convert those capital dollars toward operations to address near-term needs. At the same time, we do see a small window of opportunity for securing wholly new transit operations dollars, and that would be by pulling from certain sources like cap and trade, where we already have an established track record of securing dollars from that source of funding and using it for purposes of maintaining and expanding transit operations. And so as noted for you on your screen, we are working through the final details of our budget request. It will be for multi-year request for funds. It will highlight interest in, again, flexibility and also new funding resources. And that will be finalized later this month. Our expectation is that we'll be releasing a letter come next Tuesday with a public rollout to go alongside that. I'll be presenting in front of the Senate Budget Subcommittee number 5, which oversees transportation issues, come next Thursday, where I'll speak in greater detail to what we are expecting. So as we turn to the next slide, you'll see just a bit more of the schedule that we are operating on. We've been overseeing a phase campaign. The phase 1 of our campaign was really focused on raising awareness of this issue within the legislature. That frankly began in November as we began to scope this issue, but really came to a head in early January and has carried on through the end of March and into April. We are now entering into the phase 2 of our campaign, which is much more action oriented and that is focused on driving towards specific solutions. That is timed with the weeks before the release of the governor's May revise, and will really hit its stride in the follow-up to the May revise as we engage the legislature in their review of the May revise and tee up what would be actions on our budget request before the end of the legislative year in September. So as we turn to the next slide, I do want to just give you one point of reference for the type of work that we have been doing to raise awareness of this issue. Here you will see that there's a joint legislative sign-on letter that we helped organize alongside our most vocal champion in the legislature, Senator Scott Wiener from San Francisco, that really punctuated the need for there to be action by the legislature on operations funding. And what I want to highlight for you is that we have seen traction in response to these types of letters and the initiatives that we've been leading through direct advocacy. We have been invited to every major forum where the state legislature is debating the transportation budget, including in the Assembly and soon to be in the Senate. And we've seen the Senate include within its budget principles the need for there to be action on the transit operations front. And so as I conclude this aspect of my presentation, I do want to highlight for you a few other operative details here. And so if we can click to the next slide, you'll see that part of our conversation on operations funding is also moving into a conversation about reform to transit operations and transit accountability metrics. The accountability metrics front is one that we have been engaged on for a number of years now, and I'll go into a bit more detail on that in a second. But the need for reform is one that is being driven by the legislature and is an outgrowth of their perspective that if there is going to be any new resources provided to California transit agencies this year and with a multi-year program of investment, they want to ensure that those funds are being used in ways that help grow transit ridership and that ultimately build us into long-term sustainability. The message we've heard very clearly from the legislature is that they do not want to make an investment in public transit operations that simply papers over challenges that we're faced with, only to have us as an industry come back several years later asking for an additional infusion of dollars. So again, they want to drive towards sustainability And there are a number of vehicles that they are pursuing themselves to move us in that direction. One is noted for you on your screen, AB 761, by the chair of the Assembly Transportation Committee, which is being co-authored by her colleague in the Senate. That would create a new transit transformation task force that would do a top to bottom review of public transit operations in the state, our funding mechanisms, the impediments that we have toward delivering improved services that ultimately drive riders to our systems. And that is a bill that is currently moving through the legislature and one that we as an association, after receiving some further guidance from our membership, hope to support. The other bill that we are engaged on and that is an outgrowth of this broader perspective of transit reforms is SB 434 by Senator Min. And this bill is looking to get at a very trenchant issue for us as an industry, and that is the incidence of harassment and violence on our systems that is oftentimes directed toward women, toward people of color, toward people of the LGBTQIA community, and that can oftentimes serve not only as an unpleasant or unwelcome experience, but also something that is driving people away from our systems. And so this bill would require the 10 largest agencies in the state to do a review through a survey of their ridership, of the challenges that they face with street harassment on their systems. And it will serve as the precursor to what would be a request by the legislature to begin to develop and implement strategies for addressing that incidence of harassment. I would note in the same breath that we were very actively having a conversation also around the incidence of homelessness on our systems. Here, I want to be clear, not every instance of homelessness on our systems is necessarily a matter of safety or harassment, but there are times where there is that intersection, and that is something where we are petitioning the state to provide some additional resources. Much of that work is being steered by our standing committees and task forces. Now, as we turn to the next slide, I do want to highlight one area that I know has been of a point of interest for NCTD and the broader Sandag region, and that is TDA reform. We had begun a process in 2018 to reform the Transportation Development Act. And as we were developing our recommendations that were going to be delivered to the legislature in 2020, we were, of course, hit with the COVID-19 pandemic in March of 2020. Much of the work that we had ideated through our task force process became what we refer to as statutory relief. That is, for example, creating a series of new exemptions from what is used to calculate fare box recovery and your efficiency criteria under the Transportation Development Act. We were able to secure in 2020 and 2021 the inclusion of new exemptions on a permanent basis within budget actions. We were also able to secure a temporary pause on the imposition of penalties for noncompliance with the fare box recovery requirements, the STA efficiency criteria requirements that will soon be expiring at the end of fiscal year 22-23. That's our current fiscal year. And so one of the things that we have on our to-do for our short-term efforts that intersect with TDA reform is to get further extension of that relief, taking us out to at least fiscal year 24-25. And why that is important is that it creates some additional runway for us as an industry to go back to that broader conversation of TDA reform and re-scope and re-envision our recommendations for long-term solutions, recognizing that so much of our work was already incorporated within statutory relief, but there is still some additional work to be done to make sure that we have created a foundation for accountability that is right-sized and appropriate for how we are now experiencing our transit operations. And much of that conversation is going to be consumed or rather brought into that AB 761 process, that Transit Transformation Task Force. We've heard very clearly from the transportation committees that as part of this top to bottom review that I've referenced, they want to include that broader conversation about reforming the Transportation Development Act. And so in terms of next steps, we are going to be focused on extending that statutory relief as part of the budget process. That will give us at least an additional 2 years of relief. And then we will use that 2 years of additional runway to oversee that Transit Transformation Task Force process through its completion that will itself result in recommendations to the legislature for reforming the Transportation Development Act. So as I conclude, I do want to touch on one final thing. And if we go to the next slide, it's a matter of fare free and how it fits into this broader conversation around our pursuit for operations dollars, but then also to this broader conversation about reform. Here I'll note for you that Assemblymember Chris Holden of Pasadena has once again introduced fare-free transit legislation that would create a statewide program, and I would note an elective program that agencies can choose to subscribe to in this legislative session. Now, I want to highlight that last year, the same legislation, fully the exact same statutory construct, did make its way to the governor's desk. Governor Newsom had vetoed that bill last year because there was not an appropriation attached to it to actually see the program funded and to have a structure that agencies could actually subscribe to. And so in light of that, the obvious question that is before the legislature is whether or not there is appetite to provide an appropriation to support the implementation of Mr. Holden's new bill, which is now AB 610. And as we have scoped and engaged with the legislature on this item, I think the early feedback is that there is not budget capacity to provide support to ultimately implement this program. All that said, I do want to acknowledge that the budget development process is a long process. We're going to see it extend through the end of the year. Certainly, there is a potential for there to be a compromise on an investment that moves that program forward. We've just not seen clear traction on that just yet. And so the specific request that Mr. Holden has delivered that his supporters in the advocacy community have asked for is $100 million in new support. But again, as I've noted on the screen, there's that $22.5 billion projected budget deficit likely to grow. It's going to be exceedingly difficult to secure funding at that level for one very specific purpose. But of course, as the budget picture clarifies, we'll have a much clearer perspective on what the viability of that legislation is as it continues to move forward. And so at this time, I'm prepared to conclude my presentation, take any questions or comments that board members may have. And again, just want to redouble in thanking you and your staff for the opportunity to be before you today.
Great. Thanks, Michael. And thanks, Chris and Mary, for the presentation. And before we go to board member questions, so do we have any public comments?
No, Madam Chair.
Great. Thank you. Well, then I will turn to the board and see if there are any questions. I know I have some, but I'll wait. Board member Weiss.
Just a question to Matt. What's the projected impact of revenue decrease to NCTD?
Well, as we sit today, our 5-year budget remains balanced.
Thank you. Any other questions? I saw board member Jenkins and then I'll go to board member Contreras.
Let's see, I have a couple questions. Thank you for the presentation. You mentioned about capital money maybe being able to be used for, I think you said near-term needs. So I'm not sure if that's a question for you or Matt. So does that mean capital money being able to use for other than one-time costs?
Well, so let's just first deal with, we're not in a position that we would need to do that.
Okay.
Okay, so, and I think what Michael is speaking towards is kind of potential legislation. We had it as part of the federal COVID relief legislation where they broadened the category of eligible expenses to include operating expenses. Again, it's not, a bigger pie discussion. It's the same pie. And it's just intended to give agencies who may need greater flexibility, the ability to navigate different economic circumstances. But again, this is not applicable for NCTD as we sit today.
Okay. And then there was mention about the COVID relief funds. Isn't there a time deadline for those to have been spent?
No, so there was essentially 3 tranches. The first tranche was the one that had a timeline on it. The last 2 tranches did not have the timeline. We're in the process spending down our remaining over the next 5-year budget period.
Okay. And then when you mentioned about the full fare program, is that something, and I know it's in process, is that something that would be 100% funded? Or do we not know? Would we have to absorb some of those costs? Or would they be funding that 100%?
That's a Michael question.
Yeah, so the structure of the program will wholly be dependent on the level of appropriation that the legislature provides, but is currently contemplated. The program would be supported with an $100 million appropriation that is intended to provide multi-year support to the agencies. Now, what I'm sure you all know well, we've got about $2 billion in fare revenues that are collected by agencies on an annual basis. And so $2 billion relative to the $100 million, there's no way that that program is going to be able to fully account for the cost of providing fare-free transit to agencies statewide, not on a holistic basis. And so what this program would do would provide agencies with the opportunities to apply for funds in a fairly turnkey fashion. Everyone would have a sliver of that $100 million that would be presented to them as agencies. And then you would be charged with developing programs that would meet the level of funding that is provided. There is an expectation that there would be a cost sharing aspect in that agreement. And within the current structure, the focus is in really facilitating partnerships, and this is to the point of cost sharing between transit agencies and educational institutions that is defined as K through 12 institutions, California community colleges, the CSU system, and the UC. And the idea here is, and I'll take an example not from your region, but one that I know fairly well, and that would be between AC Transit in Oakland and UC Berkeley, and of course the city of Berkeley, where agencies would be, rather AC Transit has an existing ClassPass program that is funded in part by student assessments. The idea here is that AC Transit would be able to partner with UC Berkeley, put in a joint application, and perhaps a portion of those student assessments could be deferred, in essence, returning some monies back to the students, or there could be an agreement whereby AC Transit signals, we want to deliver to UC Berkeley better service. And so they would maintain in place their existing agreement. AC Transit would use the money received from the state to perhaps decrease headways to make the service more attractive and encourage more riders. And so it is a fairly narrow construct that the bill offers. But I would note one thing, and this would be material to you all in the Sandag region, is that it does afford an opportunity for agencies that have a current 18 and under program, which I understand the broader Sandag region between NCTD and SDMTS has in place for a pilot basis, to be able to access these dollars for purely operational expenses. Under that circumstance, there is still that idea of a cost share and a maintenance of effort, but you would then be able to unlock those dollars toward perhaps expanding that program. So if you want to say today, we've got an 18 and under program, we want to see that expanded to 25 and under or 21 and under, you'd be able to use those dollars as a supplement to reach that additional population. Or you can do what I had outlined under my UC Berkeley and AC Transit example. You can decrease headways, increase frequency as a way of making your fare-free program that much more attractive to everyday Californians. And the thought process there is making sure that the state isn't fully taking on those costs, that we maintain and we respect a lot of the agreements that are in place already and find ways to supplement them.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Board Member Contreras and then Board Member Desmond.
Thank you so much for the presentation. A lot of useful information. I want to just bounce off on this question and comments made about the 18 and under here in our region. It's been very successful. It's been incredibly successful. I think there's 3 times the amount of ridership from that youth population, and NCTD hosts 2 of the bus routes that have seen a huge increase in ridership, the 303 and the 305. I think it's imperative for us to continue the 18 and under youth opportunity pass, and anything that can be done at the state level in conjunction with NCTD in order to realize that effort and make it a permanent program is absolutely necessary. It's valuable, and it helps really get to our state goals too when it comes to different mandates that we get from the state for climate. I appreciate looking at different student populations, but the reason that I like the 18 and under is that it doesn't stipulate that you have to be a student. So that's why I think it's so critical. Our youth are able to access different recreational opportunities, employment opportunities, and not have to bug their parents to do that. And they already, they get embedded into the public transportation system. And I see a ton of youth. When I leave here, I'm probably going to see a ton either on the Sprinter or the bus, depending on what time the meeting ends and what I can catch. But, seeing as how this region has been really forward thinking, how many regions MPOs have a program with free ridership? I don't know if you
So I don't have a full perspective on who else has employed a similar universal fare free program in the way that the Sandag region has. I know that within LA County, LA Metro has recently introduced a Go Pass program more focused on the student age population that has allowed for really similar experience, and they've seen similar results on this fare free front. But generally, the models that we've seen most directly employed have shied away from that universal aspect and have focused in more on these partnerships with educational institutions. And I think the reason for that historically has been that there has been something of a dearth of state support for providing these fare-free programs, and recognizing the hit that these programs can have on your fare box collection. Agencies have been looking for ways to help supplement what is that loss in fare revenue. And much of that has come about through student assessments at the community colleges, UC and CSU, and then also through partnerships between individual school districts and the transit agencies. But certainly, Mr. Holden's Bill AB 610, in having a second section and a second set of provisions that speak to 18 and under populations, is one that is looking to drive folks toward universality over these types of kind of wall-gardened, limited programs that require that stipulation that you be a student. And so I would say certainly there has been an interest in the legislature in moving us in that direction of universal access. And as programs continue to be developed and hopefully funded at the state level, that will be the continued focus, I believe, of the legislature, given the conversations we've had over the last roughly 5 years on these programs.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds like it's more of a cost constraint that would lead people to look at partnering, right? And I just want to say the reason that I asked the question about how many different programs are out there is because we have been forward thinking as a region. I think we should be honored for that with some money because the program is about $8 to $9 million a year. It's just been very successful in having a universal 18 and under is just so much more inclusive and really gets to equity issues. But I also want to highlight something that you said, which is really important, and something that I've seen as the Youth Opportunity Pass has shown so much success, is that our buses are really full. And having that increase in frequency and having more operation dollars in order to increase the frequencies is going to be a critical component of the success of a universal program of 18 and under. And for sure, if it increases to 24 or 25 and under, that's going to be absolutely critical for the system. And just, to go off of transit operations, definitely, again, increased frequencies are much needed, and also more rapid systems, because here in North County Transit District, we currently have 0 bus rapid transit. So that's really necessary to connect our different populations to, especially employment centers, which can be very difficult to access at this time using public transit. And the last thing I want to say, and one, thank you again for going through the TDA reform. I look in anticipation to see what happens there. But I wanted to comment on folks that are experiencing homelessness on our system. And this is something that I want to highlight board member Desmond, because he was able to bring forward a pilot program that worked in conjunction with North County Transit District. And I think it's really critical. We know that folks that are experiencing homelessness are utilizing public transit and they're at transit centers. And what I don't see enough is collaborations within different jurisdictions and different agencies to connect these folks with resources. So anything that the state can do to make it easier for our jurisdictions to work together. I'll give an example. The city of Vista, we have a social worker. We have more than one now, and we have different resources. But I don't think that there's an easy way where those resources at this time are being connected to NCTD and the population utilizing our transit center and our transit services. So anything that can be done at the state level to use the resources that we already have and allow for more fluidity between these different resources is going to be critical. And then any additional funding that can be done to build out those resources. But other than that, thank you so much. And I appreciate all the updates.
Great. Thank you,
All right.
board member.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Matt, okay, as far as NCTD is concerned, I heard you say we're good for the next 5 years.
Correct.
Okay, and I'm just, and Michael gave the presentation, it's a statewide view, and they're showing each entity. Where do we fall, I guess? When's our COVID dollars run out?
So remember, so we produce a 5-year, we anticipate it to be fully spent during the 5 years, but we very conservatively budget. And
So when's the
well, I
question?
keep saying we don't have a cliff.
We don't have a cliff.
We don't have a cliff. Now,
Okay.
when I give you that answer, I feel like I better put some asterisks around it because I know how it
Well, you're
rolls.
gonna cloud it with asterisks.
No,
I'm
I'm
just
gonna,
trying to-
well, if there's a downturn in the economy and sales tax revenues decline, then we're gonna be in a different position. So the 5-year budget assumes certain levels of performance of the economy. So all things being equal, our budget remains balanced for the 5 years.
Okay, and after that, I guess we'll see
Well,
what happens. I guess-
well, when we develop the budget, we also do the stress test for 10 years, right? But
Okay.
again, the further you go out, once you get past 5 years,
Yeah.
it's really hard to say that it's something you can go to the bank with. But again, the agency, I don't want you guys to be confused. Some of those agencies are really big agencies, and they're primarily rail agencies that were heavily driven by commuter traffic, of people coming into the Bay Area, things like that. It's just a different, it's just a different impact because their fare box recovery ratios were significantly higher pre-COVID, significantly higher. NCTD's was lower. And so the impact to us is less, and we have more ways to be able to make up the budget shortfalls from declines in passenger ridership than those big agencies.
So we don't have a fiscal cliff that we're looking at for the next 5 years or for the foreseeable future.
We don't have, as we said today, any issue in terms of fiscal health.
Okay, all right. I'm just sitting as a board member here, wondering what the heck's going on. So thank you.
Was that it?
Yes.
Okay. I see board member Contreras raising her hand again. So board member Contreras.
I
And
just,
then
I
I'll
just
ask.
wanted to offer a little bit more on what you said, Matt, because, when we look at San Francisco, I mean, the issue is that they have almost like a dead city at this point. And we're so different than that's probably why it's incredibly a different landscape. So we don't have those same challenges, which is good, which is also why I think the state should really give us more money to do the excellent work that we're doing. So thank you.
And one last thing, just to make sure that you feel good about where we're going. So we have put a proposal on the table for Sandag, but 18 and under program that would keep it in place for 3 years. We have not yet received solid feedback from Sandag accepting our proposal, but our proposal imminently works for the next 3 years.
Thought it was 5.
Youth Opportunity Program.
Okay. Hey,
You're just like really working hard to get me, right?
I'm really, saying, hey, Desmond, why didn't you do a damn thing about it? So thank you.
Okay. Great. All right. So I'll ask my questions, and then once we're done with those, then I know we have Board Member Hinsey and Chair Edson that have joined us as well. And we're still on the first item, so you all are right on time. So the first question that I had, which was answered, just so you're aware, was where is NCTD on this? And I appreciate that you've already answered that we're good in terms of the next 5 years. For the other one, this is specifically around the May revise, because I'm just curious. I know it sounds like one of our, or just in general, the transit agencies asks will be around funding during the May revise. And usually with the May revise, from what my understanding is, that generally happens for whether it's emergency funding or funding for programs that haven't necessarily been looked at. So I was just curious, what the likelihood of receiving that money during that time would be. Like, how comfortable are we feeling, and what is the actual specific ask for? I know it's
so I
not for
would
us. He said he was talking about transit agencies in general. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say that on that front, the May revise is unlikely to include really any significant details on new appropriations, and that is not the result of a lackluster advocacy campaign. Rather, it is a function of this challenge that we are faced with as a state with regards to the tax filing deadline. So in typical years, folks have filed their taxes by mid-April. Come the May revise, the state is presenting on its updated financial outlook. This year, because of the extreme weather events that we've experienced across the state, both the federal and state government have extended the deadline for filing taxes for most counties in California through October. And so come the May revise, the state is going to have very little information about what its financial outlook will actually be to be able to present information around new expenditures. And so very likely what we will see is a fairly austere May revise. It will likely point to a deepening budget deficit. And if there is going to be action on the operations funding front, also transit capital front, we would anticipate that will happen in successive rounds of budget actions. We often will have here in the legislature the introduction of what they might call a budget bill junior. That is a series of new appropriations to make adjustments to a budget that is passed earlier in the year, that comes often at the tail end of legislative session, as well as budget trailer bills, which implement policy to bring online various budgetary investments or to make more substantial policy changes that also happen toward the end of the legislative year. And so I would argue that if we see progress on this front, it will unlikely to be evident until the August to September timeframe. And that is, again, just a function of the state having a lack of clarity on where it will land. And as you can imagine, folks aren't going to want to make appropriations if we don't yet know what the state of our budget will be for that successive budget year of fiscal year 23-24. And so those are some of the challenges that are before us. I would note that on the precise budget parameters, that is still very much an item that we are finalizing the details on over the next 2 days. We've made significant progress in identifying the funding sources, preferred funding levels from a variety of them. We're looking to really dial in the details on about 2 additional programs that will then allow us to issue our request. And so I'm afraid I'm going to have to punt on that more directly for today. But without a doubt, I can follow up with Executive Director Tucker and his staff, make sure that they are apprised of where we are landing as of the end of this week, so that information can be transmitted to the board and you have some greater clarity on what that will look like as we proceed.
Okay.
And Vice Chair, I just wanted to add, although the request for operating dollars isn't necessarily what NCTD is advocating for, we did send a letter to legislative leadership last year as part of last year's budget. The budget bill included language that had an aspirational goal that in the next 2 fiscal years, the legislature would appropriate a pot of funding, $2 billion each year for that would just go directly to transit agencies via formula for capital expenses. The governor in his budget proposal in January noted that that would be decreased to 1 billion in his proposed budget, and then would trail off thereafter. So we sent a letter to legislative leadership asking for the full 2 billion to be appropriated. NCTD can expect to receive about $30 million from that appropriation. That would allow us to leverage federal investment. As we all know, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act appropriated 5 years worth of significant investment in transit and rail. So we would need dedicated state funding to be able to leverage that investment. So not necessarily advocating for operating dollars, and that might be an aspirational ask anyway, because of all of the considerations that Michael mentioned, but we are advocating for an increase in capital dollars.
Yeah, and it's all connected, right? So that's why the question. So really quickly, you said we had initially asked for the 2 billion and now it's been scaled down to 1 billion. I'm just confirming that it was a B. Okay. And then from that, we would, from the 1 billion is what we would receive the 30 million from? Or would
No,
it be the
from
2 billion?
2 billion,
Okay,
yeah.
got it.
So over the 2, so the original goal of the legislature was 2 billion for each of the next 2 fiscal years, total of 4 billion. Governor Newsom said that it could potentially be possible to do 1 billion this year, 500 million next year. So if the 2 billion were kept for the next 2 fiscal years, NCTD could get 60 million. But for our purposes, immediately, we've only asked for the 2 billion for this fiscal year to be maintained. And that would get us 30 million.
Okay.
So if it were 1 billion, it would be 15.
Okay, great. Thank you. And you already answered, I think, what fare free meant, so I won't ask you to reiterate that. So I appreciate it. And I think the only other piece, let's see here, I'm just confirming I don't have anything else here. No, I think everything else was answered. Great. Thank you so much for anybody else, I guess, Chair or Board Member Hinsey, any questions? I know you all got in late, but just want to make sure you all can ask if you
I
have
missed
any.
most of the
Okay.
presentation, so I don't know what
Okay,
questions I might
no
have.
worries, no worries at all. All right, well, that's it for this item, and I know it's just informational, so thank you for the report, and looking forward to updates as they happen. Thanks.
All right, thank you for the.
I'm going to pass it off to our chair now at this time.
Thank you. And did you ask Suhal if there were any questions? Okay. All right. So in that case, moving on, can't get my screen to move. We're on to minutes now. May I have a motion to approve the minutes for the regular meeting of March 16th, 2023?
So moved.
Second. Oh, you got it. Okay. Motion by Bhat Patel, second by Jenkins. Please call the vote. Or please vote.
And just confirming
I'm totally discombobulated.
on the screen, it says my alternate's name. I just want to make sure that we update that for the record. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
And next, may I have a motion to approve the minutes for the special meeting of April 6th,
Madam
20?
Chair, may I call the vote?
Oh, I'm sorry.
On the motion of Board Member Vice Chair Bhat Patel, seconded by Board Member Jenkins, to approve the minutes of the regular board meeting of March 16th, 2023, motion passes.
All right. Thank you very much. And may I have a motion now to approve the minutes for the special board meeting of April 6, 2023?
So moved.
Second, Contreras. Motion by Bat Patel, second by Contreras. Please vote.
On the motion of Vice Chair Bob Patel, seconded by Board Member Contreras to approve the minutes of the special board meeting of April 6, 2023. Board Member Weiss abstain. Motion passes.
Thank you. We have 11 items on today's consent calendar. Suhel, have any members of the public requested that consent items be pulled?
No, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Board members, do you wish to pull any consent items? Seeing no hands, may I have a motion to approve consent items 2 through 12.
Motion to approve Contreras.
Motion by Contreras, second by Hensy. Please vote.
On the motion of Board Member Contreras, seconded by Board Member Hensy to approve consent items 2 through 12. Motion passes.
Thank you. We have 2 other business items today. The first will be presented by Katie Persons, Director of Service Planning, and Chris Orlando, Chief Planning and Communications Officer. This item is a request to award an agreement for a microtransit application that will be used as the backbone for providing this on-demand service. As the board's aware, the implementation of microtransit service is a critical element in the district's strategy to attract riders and enhance customer riding experience. Katie and Chris, the floor is still yours, or yours again.
Thank you very much, Chair Edson. As the chair noted in the board workshop earlier this month, we heard about the importance that microtransit will play in generating future ridership. What you have before you today is our first step towards implementing a broad microtransit strategy. It is the procurement of a software as a service platform that will allow us to implement a microtransit service within the service area. Katie's going to walk you through the procurement process and a description of the preferred provider and what the service will do. So I will hand it over to Katie.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Next slide, please. So NCTD issued a request for proposals on May 27th of last year. The solicitation closed on August 11th, and we received 7 proposals. After review of those proposals, NCTD requested software demonstration from 3 contractors. Next slide, please. Before we get too far along, we wanted to clarify a few terms that we'll reference in this presentation. The first is microtransit, and in this context, we mean on-demand service within a specified geofence zone, oftentimes anchored by a major rail or bus station, operated with a 12-passenger ADA accessible vehicle with an NCTD operator. The second is rideshare, which has similar zone characteristics, but is operated by a transportation network company such as Uber, Lyft, Yellow Cab, or UServe, and those fleets have varying levels of ADA accessible vehicles. The third is paratransit, which is federally mandated ADA demand response services like our Lyft mode. Aside from the modes, there are 2 operational concepts that we'll also reference. The first is non-dedicated fleets or open fleets, which means utilizing those rideshare services to increase a zone capacity or service capacity without deploying NCTD vehicles. So that means utilizing rideshare services to increase the zone capacity and fulfill that demand. The second concept is commingling, which occurs when there are 2 distinct services within one zone, so microtransit and paratransit, that would utilize the same operational resources. Next slide, please. As Chris mentioned, procuring this software is an important first step in NCTD's short and long-term goals for deploying more first-last mile services and on-demand connections. Previously, NCTD deployed microtransit in coordination with Carlsbad and Sandag, and more recently has deployed rideshare-based services with Uber, Lyft, and TripShot. For context on NCTD's Lyft service, we currently utilize Trapeze software for scheduling and dispatching of paratransit trips. We do utilize select taxi subcontractors for specific Lyft trips with an interest in expanding that functionality. And the reason we're referencing Lyft here is that when developing the RFP, we included a variety of elements that would enable us to potentially schedule and dispatch all of our on-demand services within one software platform, which we'll discuss in a few slides. Next slide. So as part of the request for proposals, we included a software requirements checklist alongside our scope of work. In total, we had 91 required software features and 18 optional software features across 6 main categories. We won't discuss them all today, but we did want to highlight a few on the customer-facing side. Next slide. So NCTD's instance of the app would be available for download in major app stores, as well as offer a web-based interface and call-in option. We included a variety of software features related to fare payment, including credit and debit cards, Apple and Google Pay, and a cash payment indication option for trips taken on NCTD vehicles that would be equipped with fare boxes. The app would be available in English and Spanish, and we would have the option to include additional languages as needed. We also required the identification of specific seat needs to allow individuals to book multiple seats in one trip on behalf of their family or friends, or to indicate the use of a mobility device. We also included a variety of contact options to support daily operations and customer service. Customers would be able to see real-time vehicle information and arrival and departure times. And we included a specific section on software security and privacy requirements that are relevant not only to those microtransit services we could deploy in the near term, but also to those paratransit services we could potentially incorporate in the long term. Next slide, please. So Spare Labs, or Spare, is staff's preferred contractor for the software as a service. Spare, as the primary contractor, also included local contractor Cook and Schmid for marketing and outreach responsibilities. Within that proposal, Spare also indicated ongoing partnerships with the Transit app and Lyft, and the contract will reflect the necessary work effort for a deep link integration with the Transit app, as well as future opportunities to deploy open fleets or non-dedicated fleets with a variety of taxi and TNC providers. Ultimately, NCTD will hold separate contracts with selected TNC providers to ensure close oversight, but trips can be dispatched through the software service. And last, we included work effort within the contract to reflect the necessary steps for evaluating the feasibility and nature of a Pronto integration. Next slide. So there are 4 key elements to the contract vision that we'll step through. The first is the baseline mobilization of the contract and NCTD Spare app instance and necessary testing work. The proposal estimates at least 12 weeks to mobilize the Spare app for use in NCTD Plus microtransit services, subject to optional features that NCTD deems necessary for implementation. In the more near term, this software would be used for deploying microtransit pilots within the service area as operator resources become available, and in coordination with local jurisdictions to support a successful pilot period. The next element is the evaluation and deployment of expanded features that NCTD had specified in the RFP. We'll have a couple examples of what this means on the next slide, but a key element of project mobilization will be the scoping of those optional or custom features. Third, we have, back one, 2 more. Third, we have the evaluation and business systems assessment of the potential replacement of NCTD's existing Lyft paratransit software, Trapeze, with a potential transition to Spare. The RFP was written with software requirements that are relevant to paratransit services. However, there's still a substantial work effort to evaluate and plan for this transition. The deployment of microtransit services in the near term would allow for greater familiarity with the new system, which would help inform that effort. And finally, assuming that NCTD transitions all demand response services under one software program, we would evaluate the feasibility of commingling both microtransit and paratransit services to achieve maximum efficiencies. And again, that requires a comprehensive assessment of policies that are particular to the provision of paratransit services in order to ensure a successful implementation of both commingling and Trapeze replacement. Next slide, please. So stepping back to the expanded features, some of the items that we're contemplating include customer incentive programs, employer-sponsored voucher programs, It also includes integration with Pronto, Transit app, the use of non-dedicated or open fleets, integration with the California Integrated Traveler Project and other regional and state initiatives. And some of those initiatives and integrations are more challenging than others. So they'll become available at varying timelines. And the project mobilization phase that we'll enter after contract execution will include scoping of those items to better understand the anticipated timeline of their availability. Next slide, please. So shifting away from the software itself into more of the service planning strategy for these types of services, we included sample zones within the RFP to provide proposers with context of our anticipated service types. As resources shift and change, we'll continue to review and refine the zones, including a prioritization effort with respect to transit potential, transit need, and transit service levels. Next slide. Not all microtransit zones will look the same or have the same goals. Some might serve first last mile connections, while others might serve to fill a transit gap that exists. All will be examined for their unique use cases, boundaries, and trip restrictions with defined performance indicators and measures of success for each specific zone. As pilot deployments progress, each microtransit zone will be further refined through observed ridership and stakeholder engagement prior to the permanent launch of the service. Next slide. So just to provide an illustrative example, we took one of the sample zones within the RFP, Sorrento Valley, to demonstrate what that strategy might look like. We would summarize the key zone statistics, the demand drivers, and major trip generators for each zone to provide context and help with the prioritization effort, as well as the zone design rationale. In this case, a zone like Sorrento Valley might include first last mile connections to the coaster station. These inputs would help inform the overall KPIs and other measures of success for the zone. Next slide. Using those design parameters, we would then establish service parameters for each zone. These items are customized within the Spare platform. For example, Sorrento Valley might have a station anchor to require trips to start and end at the station, and we could further impose timing requirements to ensure that folks arrive at the station on time and don't miss their coaster train. Additionally, we would have considerations such as walking distance that would inform our virtual stop placement strategy, maximum wait time for the customer to inform resource requirements, and allowable detours. And again, each zone is going to be a little different and will entail a mini mobilization effort for each one, but these are the types of considerations that would inform the overall service design. Next slide. In looking towards actual implementation of microtransit service, each zone would be deployed on a 12-month pilot basis to start. During and after the pilot period, NCTD and Spare will assess performance, which will inform the final determinations on long-term implementation of each zone. Any long-term launch of these services would require the necessary Title VI equity assessments and outreach, which we would conduct in accordance with board policy. And then the budgeting of microtransit services beyond the pilot period would be considered by the board in the annual operating budget process. Next slide. So this table includes a breakdown of the main cost categories within the proposed contract subject to negotiation. We won't go through all of them, but we did want to highlight a few. The licensing fees for the software are dependent on the number of active vehicles within the fleet. We included assumptions for microtransit service deployments in years 1 through 3 of the contract and potential inclusion of the Lyft paratransit fleet starting in year 4. The dispatching module is also dependent on NCTD's execution of the open fleets module and would include a monthly fee, and then a per trip dispatching fee for each trip in a non-NCTD vehicle would apply for actual trips taken. And our contract assumes an annual amount across both NCTD plus microtransit and Lyft modes. We also included an hourly rate of support for training and marketing and outreach support. And finally, we included an hourly rate of support for future integrations and customizations that are not included within the base software package to be used as needed. Slide. With that, the staff recommendation is to authorize the executive director to an award agreement to Spare Labs, Inc. for the purchase of microtransit software services for a base period of 5 years with 2 two-year options in an amount not to exceed $5,621,800. Subject to successful negotiations and concurrence with General Counsel. And that concludes our presentation.
Thank you very much. That was very informative. I have a feeling we'll have a number of questions, but before we move to board questions, Suhel, do we have any public comments on this item?
No, Madam Chair.
Perfect. Who would like to start? I have a feeling there's going to be some questions. Okay, Director Hinsey?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited about the potential of this. And in advance of this item, I had emailed you with some questions because it's a priority for Encinitas to be able to leverage some of the microtransit potential for our Miracosta campus. And then I was really pleased to hear that not only had you been reaching out to the Miracosta folks, but also to the San Diego Union High School District folks. And so I think what I'm understanding is that we're going to be hopefully approving this today, which is the agreement with the software. And then it will take some time for us to be refining the different zones and things like that. So I am curious to know how that zone process is going to go. You outlined it a little bit, but do I have it right that we're not going to really be able to advance microtransit any earlier than this process of going through the zones and the software and all of these things? Is that what I can expect a couple years from now? We'll have a plan in place?
We're
You want this one?
So we have to go through an implementation process with the software first. So set up the software, get comfortable using it, do the zone development part. I think a couple years is probably farther out than we would do it. It'd be sooner than that. But important point would be that this is also subject to driver availability. And so, the primary constraint would be, do we have the resources from a driver standpoint to execute the zones and start them? I think that'll be the primary time constraint. And so, could be later this year as the soonest, but probably into next year when we have some initial zones ready for deployment.
Okay, that sounds good. And I remember feeling jealous of Carlsbad for their pilot program, but I'm happy to have and understand why they did. So anything that we saw earlier to the zones being fully developed, is that going to be in another pilot form, or we're going to be doing some testing? Is that what we could expect?
You're referring to this 12-week kind of implementation period. Is that the question?
It sounds like you said as early as this year, something could be up and running. Would that be a pilot, or that just be an early phase of the micro zone rollout?
Yeah, each zone would start out as a pilot for a 12-month period. And then after that period, we would determine kind of a permanent launch. So you could start to see those pilot periods begin within the year.
Awesome.
It would just depend on the operator resources, like Chris mentioned. Once we do execute the contract, we'll have access to one of their modules that helps us to do a bit more modeling specific to microtransit. So we'd be able to use that resource before determining future zones and anything like that. So that would still be a resource available to us before we're actually launching services.
Awesome. That's really exciting. Thank you. That's all my questions for now.
And I do want to just say this because I want to make sure we talk through this in a way so board members' expectations. So the real full build out for this program is kind of the breeze, speed, and reliability study in terms of moving towards improving frequencies and then carving out more natural zones for people to be able to complete local trips and to connect at major transfer points. The team has talked about kind of intermingling some of those local community needs with ADA paratransit. I think we view that as part of giving people more freedom of mobility. As we roll out these pilots are going to be just learning activities for us around the software. You won't get to a real phased understanding implementation of impact of this until you roll out the big enchilada, until you get past the pilots and you start looking at it on a bigger scale. Because if you truly understand the whole nature of what we're talking about, it really does afford people the opportunity. There's a price differential that we're going to have to work through. But it will give people more choices in terms of the types of mobility they could take. Part of this program is dependent upon NCTD employees operating vehicles for specific types of services, like for those people who are paratransit who need to be protected and a higher level of customer service. Like for if we're going to do middle school and high school pilots, I think parents are going to feel more comfortable with that being an NCTD employee. But the freedom of with the software also leverages trips that could be done in collaboration with Uber, Lyft, UServe, you name all of these things. So the expectation is that we're rolling this out and we're learning. and figuring out the integrations of this. And it's going to really realistically be 3 to 5 years before we really get to the fun stuff. Because there are other conditions precedent that we have to get through in order to be able to do it. So we're talking about big deal change for the district. And so I don't want people to think that, bam, this is just going to drop out there and everybody's wildest dreams are going to be met. It's not. It's going to be slow and steady.
Perfect. Board Member Jenkins, and then we'll go to Board Member Drucker.
I have a question about integrating with Pronto. So I see it talks about that we'll be working to evaluate and implement the integration. So would this be a different app that people would be using
It would be,
until I'm just wondering if is that going to cause confusion? Or
potentially, yeah. The integration with Pronto, will present some challenges, particularly because, the Pronto app is a region-wide app, and so it's
Right.
not just our service area. The payment functions would be potentially different. And so, we recognize from a user standpoint and from a use case that is really important. But it's going to require some scoping and some study about how we actually go about doing it. So this would be standalone for the initial pilots for sure.
okay, because it seems like that could be frustrating to the users and maybe cause them maybe not to use it because they could be dealing with two apps, right?
Yeah, we recognize that it is a limitation, but we've written into the RFP that integration, and so we know that's something that we have to work towards, as we do the pilot programs.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Board Member Drucker.
Thank you for the presentation. It's kind of following on what Sharon talked about. If I'm going to use this microtransit application and I'm going to take the coaster down to Sorrento Valley, and then I have a choice then of using the coaster connection or using this microtransit. If I use the microtransit, is that an extra charge? Or if I use the coaster connection, I don't have a special charge?
Right, yeah, so as Matt alluded, we haven't established the fare structure yet, but this is a premium service. And so we would anticipate there would be an extra charge, and the fare structure will look differently than you would see on Sorrento Valley Coaster Connections.
So that would say that it's probably really important to integrate with Pronto as quickly as possible. Couple technical questions, Chris. What is this? What programming language, is it written in?
Board member, you got way too.
And what cloud provider, SaaS provider is being used?
I actually don't know that also.
Okay, and then final technical is there a specific app for the Apple versus the Android, or is it one unified app?
No, it's specific for both.
Okay.
Within their app store.
Was the technical evaluated in terms of long-term, applicability of the software, et cetera? Was that looked at all in terms of when you were evaluating it?
It was, and our IT team participated in the procurement process and wrote those portions of the specs for the RFP. So yeah.
Okay. Well, at some point I'd like, just for my own information, I'd like to know those three answers. Thank you.
And I would hope that you would copy me on those answers as well. Director Contreras.
Thanks for the presentation, and just to go along with the sentiment of Pronto, absolutely, it's critical. Is there any way that we could, in the short term, have just a Pronto validator as part of the system?
So there'll be separate platforms, so it wouldn't.
Because like you
wouldn't be
could
integrated.
use Spare and then pay with Pronto, maybe? Is there any way to?
So can we talk about it in a different way?
Uh-huh.
So I'm committed to breaking every rule that we do in transit before my career is over. So I think we're talking about the wrong things, about how do we make this thing work around Pronto? So part of, the issue I see with public transportation, because I started my career on the private side of this, and the guys that were training me were guys who operated transit when transit was making a profit. And discussions, from the training that I got are different discussions than what we have today. I think as we embark on this journey, and one of our new themes is customer excellence, is that we need to kind of ask ourselves, should it be that hard to use transit? Or should I have to think about all of these different things to go and use it? And so I don't want to put staff on blast on a notion of trying to figure out the integrations. But the problem is that we're talking about how do we work around Pronto and make Pronto work? Because it's not just an issue here in terms of this application, it's an issue on the rail line in terms of how do we integrate with Amtrak and Metrolink. And so what I'm thinking that as we progress along this journey towards excellence, that we need not ask ourselves, how do we make customers bend to a model that they may or may not want? If they want that model, we should provide that model. If that model doesn't work, we have to be open to exploring different methodologies and approaches to doing it. I remain unconvinced after all of my experience in transit that any of these fare technologies that transit agencies have are better than what it was when we just had paper. Because we're spending a whole heck of a lot more money and it's still pretty complicated to access the system. So my feedback to staff would be, let's make sure as we're looking at this over the next 3 to 5 years, let's make sure we come up with an approach that is more customer centric, more standard with a customer experience when they go into any other store, as opposed to what we provide in transit. You don't have to go to Vons to be able to go shopping at Nordstrom's or Target to get a pass. We are thinking about this thing in a very antiquated way. And so we need to flip and say, as we start looking at this, we may need to break away from the Pronto towards a tool that makes more sense, or we may have multiple fare medias. It may be the case, but what I want the board to do is to free your mind away from tying everything that we do to Pronto. It's not an easy system to integrate with. It's not a standard thing that people are going to be familiar with. And if I have to use 50 words or 100 words to get you to understand something, then likely it's too complicated.
Yeah, I think Pronto is just not that great of a system. So one of my questions was, is this going to replace Pronto too? I mean, but here's one of the issues, right? We've been talking about Youth Opportunity Pass. How does that fit into micro transit? Are they not going to be able to utilize, you said it's a premium service. So I know we haven't figured out the pricing model. Does that mean that they would have to pay for the service?
From my estimation of what the cost per trip would be, absolutely, they're going to have to pay the incremental. The approach that I have in terms of how we should design this beyond the pilots, because the pilots are just pilots, right? You're going to be testing out, is that we should be context sensitive in terms of how we approach this. An example that I think we talk about as a team is, if you look at the metric for who's eligible for free lunch, we need to figure out how to take care of those kids as an example. There are going to be some kids that, just need to pay the full fare that's associated with the program. But that's something we're going to have to cross the bridge as we get there. But this is a premium trip. Think about it. If you were trying to take every trip on Uber, could it be free? Or could it be for 75 cents? That's not a sustainable business model.
Okay. Yeah. And when we're building out our zones and defining our zones, are we also taking into consideration access to like natural resources? And, I'm going to use Elfin Forest as an example. If you try to take your car there, you're probably not going to be able to find parking on the weekends. Are we looking at being able to connect folks to those types of outdoor recreational opportunities?
That's certainly something that we would include in the design parameters discussion. So yeah, we could definitely.
Yeah, I for one think that's really important. The last thing we want to do is, exclude some of those, especially it could be like a high weekend. I mean, maybe that's something that people want to pay a premium for, is get to some of these resources that are just heavily impacted by not, having the ability to even have parking in these areas. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I think, having the real-time vehicle locator, arrival and departure ETA, that's awesome. The Spare Labs do they have other agencies that they've been working with that? Can
Yeah,
you maybe
as-
highlight some of them?
Yeah, we actually had a great discussion with Des Moines Area Regional Transit, I think is their DART. They have had Spare for a couple years now, and we had a few questions for them, particularly on some of the driver app related pieces, but they had a really comprehensive program of both rideshare and microtransit type services. And they deployed it throughout a very large system. So it was really great to talk to them about their specific experience with Spare. And then we also required, as one of the evaluation criteria for the RFP, the description of past deployments and references. So we have kind of a great comprehensive list from Spare of where they've deployed in the US.
Awesome. Yeah, because I don't want to be like the guinea pig for
Yeah,
Spare
no,
Labs.
we won't be the guinea pig.
Especially because we have a timeline that we want to, accelerate. What do you call it? I forget the saying. What is it? Over deliver and under promise, right? So, in a previous board meeting, we talked about how microtransit, it seems like it's going to take, some of them are going to be replacement trips from different modes that NCTD has. So from a cost breakdown, I don't even know how to ask this question really, but it seems like this is a very expensive thing to do. I think it's important. It's important to do, but I'm just curious how much more this will cost.
So it's unknown. And because there's a lot of different moving parts. So when the staff developed this specification, they did a really good job of looking at how we could leverage this. So if we leverage this appropriately, then the software application itself is a replacement for Trapeze. And I suspect we're probably saving money compared to what we pay for Trapeze now for its software and associated applications. Then when you get on a trip by trip basis, it gets down to a lot of times with the efficiency of trip, right? And so from a paratransit point of view, the higher number of trips that you can get passengers per revenue hour, the more efficient and effective. But remember what we're talking about. Part of this is trying to create the freedom for mobility for people who ADA paratransit. Then yeah, some of the cost component of this are more expensive because if you live in a zone, and don't think about these zones as like borders, community borders, these are just virtual. You can redraw them a billion times every other day, tomorrow, wake up the next day, decide to do it behind your back. And again, all of these trips, the cost model will be relative to the service. If you're providing service for school kids, and if you draw a geofence that says, hey, only trips within X number of miles, then that has a certain cost model. It has a certain cost model in terms of how you group the trips, in terms of the efficiency of providing the trips. So it's an unknown, right? But the cost per unit is going to be more expensive than a fixed route bus because it's more boutique. And you're not going to have the same number of carrying capacity. It's the same thing when you talk to Uber and Lyft, because there used to be this thought process you could replace transit services 100% with Uber and Lyft. No, it only works relative to a certain level of capacity, just like if we were to have a discussion about when you need a freeway, right? All of these are capacity discussions, and then they drive specific costs.
So as these unknowns become known, is that something that will be reported back to the board so that we
Always.
have this?
You
Okay.
always get from us.
We love pictures too.
Well,
so
yeah,
graphs and pictures
and the
stuff.
great thing, we're required. So if you go and look at our reports, we show you cost per trip by mode.
Yeah.
So-
I think it's just important to know. I mean, I'm all for it. And I think, one of the big wins for this could be replacing that trapeze and having folks that are utilizing our Lyft services be able to go to this one system that could potentially work a lot better. And when we're looking at, defining the zones, I'm just remembering again when our discussion about the donut, and bringing in more folks that are needing to use paratransit services. So keeping that in mind when we're looking at defining zones, because I know that there is a few areas that we couldn't bring into the fold. So hopefully we can get there with this. So our vehicles that we would be using, is that called a dedicated fleet then?
Yeah. it would
Okay.
be.
So right now we don't have a dedicated fleet for this, or do we?
We do have, 12 passenger vehicles that we would be able to use. For
Okay.
transit deployments.
And in the future, are we looking to deploy electric vehicles?
I think as the technology becomes available, right now the range is not quite what we need it to be, but I could see that
Not
happening in the
close.
future.
Yeah, I mean, we actually spent a significant amount of time trying to research around this. There is not a big market out there for those types of vehicles. And then when you add also the component that there's a standard fleet that we could utilize. But then also there's a fleet that we have to have that supports persons with disabilities, wheelchair lifts and things like that. The market is not there. There are vehicles out there, but their operating performance in terms of mileage operating and need to be recharged is just not ready for prime time.
Okay. On a smaller scale though, are we looking at maybe some of these neighborhood electric vehicles that we would operate directly, or not at all?
Not
in
at
this
all.
Scope.
Not
Okay.
at all. And I would tell you, there's also kind of a thing that we have to kind of focus our resources in terms of what we're doing, because if we try to tackle everything, we're not going to do anything. And so that's on down the line for us to look at. In fact, I mean, the next presentation is going to be a presentation on zero emission rail transition.
Mhm.
And thus is just standing up this program is like the next evolution, and then the future evolution, obviously, because we have a big non-revenue fleet of vehicles as well that are gasoline power that we would also look at converting to zero emission. But all of those things have to be kind of laid out in a business construct that prioritizes, that also is tied to the technology availability and a market that's priced right.
Yeah, sure. And the last question that I have has to do with our drivers. So do we need to retrain? Is there a whole different set of training? What does that look like? Assuming that we have enough drivers.
So we actually have we've worked with the Teamsters Union and MV Transportation for some time. So all new operators that are hired are trained to be able to work on Lyft or Breeze, which is great. That means we can optimize the efficiency of the workforce. But with that said, we're going to do a massive retraining of employees anyway. We have such a new workforce, and a lot of the folks that were hired, during the COVID period, we just need to go back and retrain, and rather be on a big bus, the rail vehicle, whatever. We need to do a whole hell of a lot of training to get our employees where we need them to be from a customer service, operating safety perspective,
Okay.
and management as well.
Awesome. And I know I said that was my last question, but I just have one more follow-up question. So for folks that have a bicycle, I can't picture it in my head right now. Would our vehicles accommodate a bicycle?
No, likely not. It will not be able to accommodate the bicycles. And again, it's going to be a trade-off because you can't serve, just like an Uber today, you can't bring, you don't see an Uber vehicle show up with a bike rack.
Yeah, I just couldn't remember if the Lyft vehicles have, I mean, I would assume they don't because of so many different factors, but
Right.
I just couldn't picture it in my head. Okay. Well, I don't think do we need a motion for this?
We will, but yeah, I think there are some more questions that
All
are
right,
coming,
awesome.
like me. Director Hensy, go ahead.
I'll try to be quick, but when we went out for this bid, I assume it wasn't just the lowest bidder that we accepted. It was a whole bunch of factors based on all of the needs that we had. Okay, just wanted to make sure of that. And then the other question is, so we're approving a $5 million contract today. And sometimes, in government, we go, okay, we're going design and then phase 2 design and then implementation and this and that. This is a really big deal for $5.5 million on today's agenda. So
Go back to
I see it's up to.
Yeah, so and this is the reason we all agreed and collaborated around creating this. So what you have to understand the nature of the cost. So part of these, and I should let the subject matter. But part of this includes costs that are associated with trips. Okay, so it makes an assumption about trips, about number of vehicles, and we put in lots of contingencies because the worst thing for us to do is to award a contract and not have sufficient contract capacity to be able to execute. So when you're making this commitment to the funding, a lot of this is just dependent, the per trip dispatching fees are based upon an assumption of a number of trips that are being carried out by third parties. Follow me?
Yeah.
So it's not a give an expenditure. So you're gonna see and it's over a 9-year period. So it will play out in operating budgets.
Thank you. That's good to hear. I am having memories of prior to when I was on council, we approved a contract with the bicycle operator for rideshare that didn't end up panning out. And so it was good that we had all the off ramps available. And then I'll just on board member Contreras' point about can you bring the bikes on and off? I think what in Encinitas we're hoping to move for in collaboration with a successful bike share program is that they be throughout the community. So it's less important that we're having to create the vehicles that you could put your bike on it, and more important that when you get off that vehicle, you know that there would be a bike available for you to check in or check out close by to close that last mile. So that's it. Thank you.
That's a really good point. Director Weiss.
Yeah, just real quick, Oceanside last summer did a pilot program, something similar, where we had a shuttle program that did, was microtransit, covered the entire city west of I-5. And we're hoping by the end of May that we reinitiate that program and make it permanent. So it's going to be a 4 or 6 person electric shuttle that does the same thing. And it's an on-demand program that will go anywhere west of I-5. So depending on how successful that is, we may look to expand that depending on funding and funding availability. But I would invite all of you, once we get that going, that if you want to try it out, we'll set up a demonstration and I'll get with you, because their software system is called Ride Circuit. So I'm sure it'll something similar, but hopefully by the end of May, we'll be up and running.
That sounds great. Thank you for the invitation. I have a couple of questions. Basically, how will the rates for, how do we assume the rates for our service will differ from TNC standard rates? So I'm a regular Lyft or Uber driver to the airport, or rider to the airport.
Yeah, I think part of this is we're gonna flesh it out through the pilots. And so we don't have a specific structure as we sit today, but we will be fleshing that out as we roll it out from a pilot to next phase.
Okay, and from the aspect of a company, an organization, a community group, do you envision economies of scale for them to be able to say, oh, we have these 6 kids on our block that need to get to this school every day. We want to set that up?
Well, that would be something I think we should, obviously, we want to collaborate. In fact, even as we're hearing about what Oceanside is doing, you want to leverage. And so kind of you've moved beyond the microtransit to mobility as a service. We want to have that collaboration in figuring out how we can share and leverage resources to deliver services that are high quality at the lowest cost per unit.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Those were my only questions. Thank you guys for the presentation. It was terrific. Any more questions? No? Okay. You're free, at least maybe. The second other business item on today's, oh gosh, I'm moving so fast today. I am so moving fast today from moving so slow on the freeway. Okay, may I have a motion to approve agenda item 13?
I'll make a motion to approve. And I just want to say one last comment that it's actually really difficult to get an Uber or Lyft in Vista. So I look forward to having NCTD drivers because I've had a hard time. Thanks.
Okay, motion by Contreras, second by Jenkins. Everyone please vote.
On the motion of Board Member Contreras, seconded by Board Member Jenkins, to authorize the Executive Director to award agreement number 23056 with Spare Labs, Inc. for the purchase of microtransit software services for a base period of 5 years with 2 2-year options at an amount not to exceed $5,621,800, subject to successful negotiations and with the concurrence of General Counsel. Escondido absent, motion passes.
Thank you. Now, the second item, other business item on today's agenda is a presentation regarding NCTD plans for transitioning to zero emissions rail operations and a request to award an agreement to support the ultimate procurement and placement of these vehicles into revenue operations. The district is fortunate to have Devin, is it Rouse? Okay, Rail Strategic Advisor leading this effort. Devin previously worked at the Federal Railroad Administration, serving as the Executive Officer for the Office of Railroad Systems, Technology, and Automation. Devin has held other positions at the FRA, including Director of Passenger Rail Division and Mechanical Engineer Program Manager. I am extremely excited to hear this presentation. Welcome, Devin. And thank you for joining us. You have the floor.
Well, thank you, Chair Edson and board members and Executive Director Tucker. It is exciting to be here. This is a interesting topic, I think, that many people find. I know many of you are familiar with the bus side of the house and zero emissions and things that have been going on there. You probably haven't heard much on the rail side, and there's a reason for that. It is not as well developed as the bus side, but we're going to change that starting with today, right? So the next time, the outline here, just to touch on a few things. This is related to the action item in front of you. But in addition to that, we want to give you a little bit more background in terms of what our strategy is for converting the rail fleet to zero emissions and some of the complexities that are involved there. So we'll talk a little bit about our objectives for this program and the reasoning behind what we're doing. Overview of the zero emissions rail technologies that are out there as it stands today. Talk a little bit about our strategy itself, the outline and prospective timelines associated with it. And then we'll finish up with the RFP for support services for our zero emission rail program that we're putting forward today. So let's talk a little bit about our zero emissions rail strategy and some of the objectives. The primary goal here is to develop a plan for transitioning the NCTD fleet to a zero emissions rail fleet by the year 2035. And now, that's, I'm going to give you that as our early construction goal, right? There's a lot of things that go into what would be practical and how we're going to execute this over the next several years. But that's going to be our starting point. Part of this is to gain operational experience through the execution of zero emissions pilot and prototype phases. That's important because this is very new for this industry. Again, bus, hydrogen technology, battery technology. You've seen that in different forms of revenue service for a long time. I remember prototypes going back almost as 20 years in terms of some of the hydrogen fuel operations for bus. You don't see any in rail yet. San Bernardino is close with their hydrogen zero emissions ZEMU, as we call it, up there. But there's really no other, there's no revenue operations outside of electric borne systems where you have catenary. So piloting and understanding this technologies to make informed decisions is part of why we're here today and the decision before you to make some informed decisions, get the information we need to really execute what is going to be a complex and large program in a number of years. Part of that is to identify the capital needs and what the practical execution timelines can be. And capital needs are important here because unlike what we're used to in the diesel locomotive world or diesel MU world, we're probably going to need quite a bit of changes to convert to a zero emissions fleet. That's changes not only on the infrastructure itself, depending on fueling systems, if you talk hydrogen, or just charging capabilities, if we're talking battery electric, but also our shop facilities and how they're set up, what they can do, yard facilities, and safety in general for these technologies versus what we're used to today. And then the end goal here is to procure and implement a zero emissions fleet, both locomotives and MUs for our coaster and sprinter services that would align with our sprinter replacement needs and our operational goals for getting to a zero emissions fleet by 2035 and opportunities for reduced operational costs as well. And I'll put that out there. We can talk about that more, but I think there are some opportunities here to help not only expand to zero emissions, but also rein in some operational costs by efficiencies of our coaster and sprinter operations, which we'll talk about, but also the potential for, driving away some variability with diesel costs and things of that nature that we face today and may face in the future. Next slide. So why are we looking at this now? A number of reasons. Some external drivers, California Executive Order N7920 being one of them, and some of the proposed legislation and regulations that feed out of that, most notably CARB's in-use locomotive regulation that I'm going to touch on a little bit on another slide that's been being developed over the past year or so. Some internal drivers and the need to replace the Sprinter fleet that kind of coincided with this whole effort. We've been looking at that for some time and what our options are there, and some of the operational efficiencies that I mentioned, potentially merging what is right now a segregated service because of the crashworthiness aspects of the Sprinter and having it be in shared use temporal separated service versus what we have on the coaster, and potentially merging those two operations. And also the fact that we're going to have to go zero emissions anyways because of those external drivers. So it just makes sense to be looking at what can we do now to replace that fleet in the coming years when we need to. There's also some opportunities that are unique here. This corridor and these operations are very well suited to prototyping. And I think that's not only going to help us get a leg up in terms of understanding what we need to do in the next several years, but also help the industry as a whole. We have it's a relatively small operational footprint versus some of the other railroads out there. So that means we can actually use this technology. Many of the other operations, especially intercity, it's just not capable today. Battery or hydrogen. It's just outside of the realm of what's possible. Not us. We also have fairly short train consists. We don't have very long ones. So the operational pull there is quite capable. And we also have both key technologies. We have locomotive hauled and we also have MU. So it's a great platform to really get some experience, potentially go out there and get some grant money to leverage what our corridor can provide, not only here, but the entire industry, and really sell that. Thank you. Next slide. So talking about one of those external drivers, the in-use locomotive regulation is one of those. This rule would drive operators of locomotive equipment to go to 100% Tier 4 operations by 2035. We're in good shape there because we are going to be there by this summer with the delivery of our final chargers. But drive to 100% zero emission operations by 2047. And I think what they've added to the most recent rule or draft text is that it would require 50% by 2040. So that's some of the main reasons why we need to start today, especially because of the potential infrastructure costs associated with this. We need to make sure we're making smart decisions when time comes to execute on those elements on the further end. This is set for a vote, I think, on the 27th. And I think if there's any more questions on that, I don't know if Mary escaped or she's still back there. I'll toss it to her later, but that's one of the major drivers as to why we're looking at this today, and we want to get a head start of trying to execute this program. Okay, so what is zero emissions rail technology? And you're probably all very familiar with this from the bus side of things. You can go to the next slide. It really boils down to three main technologies: your electric, pure electric, battery electric, and hydrogen, primarily in the form of hydrogen fuel cell. But also there's also internal combustion hydrogen technologies out there that aren't purely zero emissions. There's still some emissions, but they're probably more capable than what just fuel cell is able to do today. Electric has been around for a long time. You're probably familiar with what Caltrain has been doing up north. Most people forget, early 20th century US had probably one of the largest electric networks out there for rail. That really went away with the advent of the diesel electric locomotive, especially because of the spaces that we have to cover, and most of those carriers were freight carriers at the time, whereas most other countries like Europe and Japan really accelerated in the adoption of electric technology. So we've kind of seen a renaissance recently with Caltrain and Denver RTD. And obviously many people are familiar with the smaller transit side when you look at trolleys and streetcars, and even some rapid transit systems out there. The pros there is that it's very established technology. It's high performance and efficiency. You're not carrying around your energy source with you everywhere you go. And there's very well established existing product lines to choose from. So there's less variability and risk in terms of getting a locomotive or an MU. The cons are obviously the infrastructure cost. It is not cheap to build a catenary system on your whole line. And obviously there are people out there that don't care for having wires everywhere. So there's some complexities there, not only to construction and getting to approval for construction, but also the fact that operationally you have to deal with another complexity as well in case there's an incident or just maintenance cost in general. Battery electric technology, I think most people are familiar with that. That's capable today of actually meeting our needs. So that's one of the pros that we're looking at there. There's less operational and regulatory unknowns, I would say. It's very similar to just a pure electric. There are some more regulatory risks associated with it, but it's much less than what you would see with, say, hydrogen or other technologies like CNG or LNG. Cons are there's very little industry standard here. This is important when it comes to things like charging. What do you do? What do you choose? Every manufacturer right now has a different perspective on that. And I think that's part of the reason we need to start looking at this now. So we can help drive from an industry some standardized interfaces to help drive the cost of implementing this technology down. So we're not having different solutions, especially if you look at an operation like what we have here at Oceanside. You've got intercity, state-supported intercity operations with Amtrak. You've got MetroLink, you've got ourselves, and you have BNSF. If everybody has a different solution, it's going to make things very complicated to try to have everybody play nice in the same sandbox. And so being able to address some of these issues now with what we're talking about, contract before you today, it's going to help us hopefully get to some more standardized approaches to how we implement zero emissions on the rail side. Some of the other downsides, though, is that it's also dependent on a available and stability of the electric power network. And that's something that's serious and we have to take a look at in any of this work. Hydrogen fuel cells, there's certainly, you may have seen this again with what San Bernardino's been doing. Pros are that it's probably the closest direct replacement to diesel electric in terms of range and long-term potential. It's really hard to replace the efficiency of a diesel unit. That energy per density is very high. And the ability to kind of move it anywhere is really hard to replace. Hydrogen's close to doing that. It's still a very long way to getting to the same types of ranges or power needs that a commuter operation would need. There are very little experience with it in the rail sector, although that is growing, especially on the European side and some of the programs we've seen over there and also in Japan. And there's more regulatory unknowns with it in terms of where we're going to go and how it would be treated or what other safety requirements we would have for using that equipment in revenue service. Slide. Okay, let's talk a little bit about plan strategy and how that might play out and the proposed timelines associated with it. It really boils down to four main stages. Stage one is where we are today, and that's conceptual preliminary engineering and the support activities. And that's a big part of the contract that we're going to talk about here in a little bit to help us start laying the groundwork and making some informed decisions over the next several years to do this the right way and do it the most cost-effective way as well. Stage two is looking at some of those early stage execution opportunities, pilot programs, where we can really learn how the technology works, what the right size is for locomotive equipment, MU equipment, what the ranges would be, what the infrastructure needs would be. Stage three is really executing on some of those. And this is where what we're talking about here is important because, you know, the stage four is easy. That's the last part. We can go buy trains. Buying trains isn't hard. There's some complexities. No, I don't even gonna get in it. I know where you're going. Yeah. Theoretically, it's not hard, right? Depends on who you're buying it from, I guess. But in the long range, that's probably the least unknowns associated with that. Where we really need to start addressing things now is what infrastructures we need, what infrastructure we need in place, because there's a lot of long lead items that might be associated with that. In addition to actually coordinating with third parties, SDG&E and others that may have to be involved with this, getting permits, getting construction, letting those contracts. And so that's why we're talking about this today, to start working those plans through, figuring out what makes the most sense for us, where we should execute, how we should execute, and beginning to lay those seeds so that when we do buy a fleet, we're able to actually run it and transition appropriately. So next slide. All right, so the preliminary timeline here, and this is just, again, wishful thinking based on setting an aggressive goal, but by no means a high level of certainty here. We've got a lot of variables that could drive this, and we want to control those by executing today. But stage one is really looking at what we talked about, the preliminary engineering and the support activities to start getting this moving. Stage two, we're really looking at around a 2-year program or more for executing some pilot prototype programs. And I want to stress that this isn't necessarily a linear pattern here. If there's an opportunity to move some of those yellow blocks to the left, if we get a grant or if there's an opportunity to get a pilot going early so we can start learning and understanding this technology, we're going to look to do that and come back before you and try to execute that in an earlier stage. Stage three is really where we make those decisions based on that data and the information we've gathered and say, okay, this is what we think is the best choice for this agency in this region. Let's go start figuring out how to convert the fleet. What do we need to do from the infrastructure side? And I would also add in there, and what you saw in the picture in the previous slide, it's not just zero emissions. We've also embedded here what to do about the Sprinter fleet. Station platforms we currently have are designed for those vehicles. And so you've got gangways right at those doorways. We may luck out and the vehicles may be identical, but the odds are that's not going to happen. And so we're going to have to convert those stations so that we could adjust for that fleet. And so this is actually envisioning that as part of this. So we can actually look at doing that and executing that to support an eventual procurement. And I just want to make sure that's clear as well. Stage 4 on the next slide. That's the fun part, go buy some trains, buy some MUs, buy some locomotives, whatever it may be. And that obviously that's generally a 3 to 5 year time frame. That's also going to depend on availability of the equipment, what we can get. There's a lot of challenges today, right? Today, none of this is produced here. There is no, if you went and got a grant for a piece of equipment and had to comply with Buy America, I don't even know how we would do it at this stage. Technology isn't here. So there's a lot of things that have to be worked out between now and then. Hopefully we'll get some experience with this and we'll know better by the time we make that decision to say, this is how we're going to do this in the most efficient way possible. So that's the proposed time frame. Again, looking at 2034, 2035 at the best possible case, but it starts today with the right level of planning and figuring out what makes sense and how we're going to do this in a way that's possible and practical. Next slide. Now, don't look at this one. This one's a scary one. All right, some rough order of magnitude costs here. There's no secret when you replace your entire fleet over the course of 15, 30 years, there's going to be some costs associated with it. What I want to focus on right now are the yellow and the orange. Yellow is kind of what we're talking about today and some of the costs that we've embedded in this contract that's going to help us get all these boxes checked off. Stage 1, especially, we've really locked into this process. Those are what you'll see in this approval here. The orange is what we're trying to figure out with that contract and how we're going to execute that and figure out, okay, what do we have in terms of wayside needs? What are we going to need in terms of maintenance and yard facility modifications, station facility modifications, and construction costs? And so that's really helping us lay some groundwork to understand what we need to do and how we can do that. Next slide. So we can get off that one. I have to look at that one anymore. Okay. Now let's talk about what you have in front of you to the consent item, and that's our RFP for zero emissions program support. This was issued back in February of this year, February 2nd, for RFP number 31570. It included 5 tasks in its scope of work. Task 1 was the initial planning and pilot program support. Task 2 was grant financing and application support. And I want to point that out because, yes, that's a big part of this is figuring out where we can get some financing, where we can get some grants. And by having our act together and having a good plan, we hope we'll be more competitive for some of those dollars. And so we want to make that a big part of this program from the outset. Task 3 is our pilot evaluation and fleet strategy development. Again, let's go learn about this, figure out what makes sense for this agency, and then develop a strategy around it. Task 4 is our procurement development support, and that's basically our traditional We're going to need engineering services to go and procure a vehicle, and in this case, 2 fleets of vehicles. So this locks us in now with a firm that's not only going to be with us from the conceptual side, but also all the way through the delivery of those vehicles. And so that's another benefit of looking at that today. And then task 5, which is optional, and that's for ongoing technical and warranty support later down the road. We received bids from 3 interested parties: STV, Hatch, which used to be called LTK, and then DBECO North America in partnership with HDR. DB was the identified as the best overall value, not only from its technical score, but also from its price. Let me go to the next slide. This is the breakdown of what we're looking for. And yes, this is a high number, but it's over a 15-year base. And again, it's the idea here is to help us start looking at how we save money in the long term. And I would point out, task 1 is really task 1 and 3 is really the big unknown here. Again, nobody's done this before. And so we're really trying to lock in some understanding of how we can do this. And so that's why we want to do this today. Task 4 is more of your traditional program support. So that number there, that's the big number that's driving up this cost. But that's pretty typical for engineering support contracts. If you look at it across the board and normalize it for the amount of years that we're looking at, it's actually a very competitive rate for what you would see. And what we would need to do anyways when we get to a point where we're ready to procure that fleet. And then task 5 is the optional additional part there. So we're looking at a not to exceed amount of about 8.3 million over the entire term. Next slide. So that's the recommendation that's in front of you for agreement 23055, and that's to award it to DB North America to provide zero emissions rail fleet strategy and support services for a base period of 15 years, and an amount not to exceed just over 8 million, with an optional task for an additional 5 years, up to 5 years, with a not to exceed of up to 8.3 million. So with that, I don't know if Mr. Tucker has any comments he would like to add to this, or we'll just jump right into the questions.
I think we're turning back over to the board chair.
All right.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation, Devin. Suhail, before we move to board questions, do we have any public comments today?
No, Madam Chair.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay. I know I have a few questions, but I'm happy to save mine if someone would like to start. Supervisor Desmond.
Thank you. And thanks for the presentation. It's very interesting and there's some outside factors that I want to make sure that we are considering as well. But you did show a slide that had like 3 different options for the energy needed, either I guess it was electric or electric plus battery, and then you had hydrogen. In this today, is that being selected? Are you going with one or the other, or it's still open at this point in time?
Still open at this point,
Okay.
right? I unless anybody's going to change my mind here, I don't think electric is really going to be feasible for most options unless.
Well, good.
Yeah.
I was going that same direction. I mean, everybody is going electric for cars with appliances and trains and everything, or whatever else. And I don't think we got the grid or the infrastructure to support all of that effort. Let me finish.
Yep.
And so it just seems that, electricity doesn't grow on trees. It gets produced somewhere, someplace. So we want to make sure that if we're dependent upon the grid, I don't think the infrastructure is going to handle that. So I guess of those 3, and I know hydrogen is very, very new, but at least hydrogen, you wouldn't be dependent on somebody else's grid. Maybe you are, I don't know. But it seems if we try to stay away from, having a 15-mile extension cord, plugged to the train going up and down the coaster or the sprinter, it seems if we can be non-dependent upon the grid would be a better option in the long run, but I don't know if feasibility, we can do that. So I'm glad you haven't picked one yet.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think that's it, right? And what I was talking about is pure electric, where we're going to have catenary everywhere.
So I don't understand what you just said.
The first one there, right, where you're going to have a wire the entire railroad. I think that's there's challenges not only in infrastructure costs, but in actually
Sounds like the
implementing
trolley. Exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Battery electric and hydrogen, I think that's where we're really going to spend most of the time studying what the difference is, the trade-off between the two. And yeah, I don't think we know enough. That's why we want to get somebody in here who has experience. And fortunate in this case, DB actually has experience overseas in Germany with both technologies. And so looking at What is it going to take? Total costs, I think, is important. But as you mentioned, dependencies. What are those dependencies? We don't want to take those for granted either. I mean,
If we
that's
can be
something that has to
independent
be.
From those other dependencies.
Yes.
Outside things that we have zero control over, then there might be a better option based on that.
And that's just it. And microgrids, other opportunities that are out there. You could even end up with a solution where you have maybe even a hydrogen station that feeds your own electric grid. So if it doesn't make sense to have the hydrogen on the train, it could also be next to it, provide you the power that you need. And so that's what we want to look at, is what are the options out there? And yeah, that's why today we wouldn't want to make a decision and say, we're going to go all out and buy this. It's just the technology is in its infancy at this point on the rail side, and there's too many unknowns.
We've got some spent nuclear fuel up at San Onofre. If we could recycle that somehow, it's very close and we could pick it up there. But anyway, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Supervisor. Any more questions? Board Member Hensy?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm struck today by how far we're having to look in the future and how many millions of dollars we're contemplating to get there. And some of the problems that seem right in front of us are so minuscule compared to how big we're being forced to think today. And my question is probably in the latter category, but I am just curious to know a little bit more about these prototypes. Like, we buy a prototype and then we test it out and we see how it works. Like, could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. And, I think that's kind of a lost art here in the US. Most other countries prototype a lot. They develop concepts before they go full in and procure something for their entire fleet. Because of the way transit has kind of evolved in this country and the size of agencies and how different they are, we just don't do that like other countries where they're much larger railroad operations and have the ability to see that far into the future and try to prototype these things. It is just that, right? We go buy 1, 2, 3, whatever it may be of different technologies. Whether we buy them or we get them through a lease or some other arrangements or borrow them from other properties, the whole point is to learn, especially from an operational standpoint. You don't maintain these the way you maintain diesel equipment. So what tools do we need? What training would we need? What type of facility setup would we need? We need the crane where it is. Do we have to have a different crane? That's the kind of stuff that I think people take for granted. And by having a prototype and learning from it and being able to say, yeah, that's not going to work. We're going to need to do this instead. If we're going to operate this for an entire fleet, that's what we're learning there. We're also learning what the actual capabilities of this technology are. Again, it's not well developed here in the rail side. And so everything we see today is just an estimate on paper. When we actually run it, we're going to learn whether or not those estimates are correct or not. Is the battery sizing correct? That's the most difficult part about this now in terms of the scale of this equipment. Diesel, you just put more in, and whether it's 2,000 gallons or 5,000 gallons, you can just fill more in and keep going. You don't have that luxury here. You have to size it according to your operations at the moment. And that's how many batteries you need or battery with fuel cell and the fuel tanks that you need to get you where you need to go. We don't know the answers to that yet. And we don't want to oversize it, right? We don't want to undersize it, obviously, because then we can't run the service. But you don't want to oversize it either, because now with this technology, there's a certain level of obsolescence with anything today, right? And so you don't want to buy more of something and then have it replace that on a 10-year cycle, let's say, if you don't need to. You want to size it right for your operations so that you're not spending more money when it comes time to maintain and do overhauls. And so that's going to help us figure out what is the right size of this equipment. How do we even approach that from an industry standard perspective so that we're not buying one product, Metrolink's not buying something completely different, and everybody's buying a custom locomotive. We really don't want to do that either. So by prototyping, it might help us understand how we can build a platform that can be flexible enough that we can still maintain some utility between our operations and, let's say, Amtrak or Metrolink or other commuters throughout the nation. So we're not in this alone. We don't have a one-off product that we can never do anything with at the end of its life, or have to go out and constantly replace customized products every time we need to replace the fleet in the future.
And I wanted to thank you for that question because it's one less that I'm going to ask. Okay, Director Jenkins.
So it's kind of interesting if you think about this, that here we are worried about increasing our ridership, and yet 24 years from now, we're talking about a whole different way of providing the service. So lots to think about. So you state that technology is not here yet. So who's working on that technology? Like we have our new equipment that Siemens, I think it was, we went up to. Who is out there working on this to make this happen in, well, less than 20 years, because you need to.
Yeah, all the major manufacturers have been looking at it for some time now. And it is quite common in Europe right now. There's a lot of different prototypes in Europe and Japan and other countries. We're just the US, there isn't that type of development market here, right? We're kind of small in the world scale of passenger rail, right? All the major manufacturers have gone away. There are no real domestic manufacturers anymore, save GM and GE, who primarily build freight equipment. So most of the R&D and development has been over in Europe and in Japan, where you have much larger passenger rail operations and much larger supply chains over there.
So is anybody looking at the possibility of, and I don't know what this means from an engineering point of view, but converting what we have to this new, because we have all these this new equipment that maybe will be obsolete by then, but is somebody looking at that to see?
Absolutely, yes. And that's part of what we're looking at for even some of our prototypes. Sprinter, for example, we've been looking at what we could do to convert that. Now we have to replace that long-term anyways. And so it would be more of just learning how the technology works and what the efficiencies are and operational characteristics are. But we're certainly looking at, could we do that and save a lot of upfront capital by using an existing platform in that example. We've also looked at using some of the F-59s that we still have, the older units that are out there. Again, you've got a proven platform. Can you scale it down, take it down to just the frame, and then build up and put a new traction system on it? I don't want to oversimplify that. It is much more complicated than that. The controls work alone and the engineering that goes into it is basically what's driving a lot of those costs and unrecoverable costs. So is there a big benefit from using an existing platform versus just taking one that's off the line for like a Charger, for example, or any of the other manufacturers' locomotives and just saying, okay, we're going to do all the control work anyway. We're just going to use a new one that's off the line. That's to be determined. And I think we'd see that by what we get back in terms of interest for prototyping. But there's certainly challenges either way, right? There's some opportunities, but there's also going to be some challenges. And in the case of locomotives, for example, it's a very short frame. So it may not have the size and capacity to put this stuff on it, to be frank.
Okay. This might be down in the weeds question, but how do we bring on this new system that needs this specialized infrastructure while our old system is still running?
I love that question. That's first off, it wasn't programming language because I wouldn't have been prepared for that. So that's good. But I think that's one of those issues that all too often people forget about. And it's no different from zero emissions or even any other technology. Look at the Sprinter itself. If we wanted to convert that or buy a new fleet, as we mentioned before, what do we do about the stations? And how do we maintain existing service? You don't just shut it overnight and say, okay, whole new fleet comes in. You've got to think about how you're going to make that transition. And so that's why we're looking at this now and trying to develop some support services to say, okay, what are our options? How do we do this? We don't want to shut the service down. We want to keep the service running. How do we manage that transition process? And how do we do it in a way that's effective, but not disruptive?
And the answer is, you don't know.
To be determined. I've got some ideas, but no, I'm going to let some experts come in and help us figure that out.
And did I hear you mention, maybe I misunderstood the wording, that the rails that the current system run on are not compatible? There was something that wasn't compatible with some of this.
The Sprinter stations.
The stations,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. the Sprinter stations.
Potentially the Sprinter stations. The Sprinter was designed as this boutique system, kind of from a European model. And over the course of time that I've been here, we've been trying to bring it back to a standard. And now as we look at this next turn, it would be bringing it back to a standard, because that a standard that we're trying to achieve will allow interoperable operations between the Sprinter and the Escondido subdivision, and take away what I think some of the specialty equipment that is more complicated to maintain from an operating point of view. There's also some real good opportunities for us to optimize the number of Sprinter station in the future, because I think we have too many stations as we sit today, but I don't want to get into it too detail. But there are certain aspects of the Sprinter operations that we had already planned. So we did a pre-study to this, which is the foundation for this update, with a focus on zero emissions technology and infrastructure change. So yeah, there's some things that would need to be changed out.
And what you're talking about specifically is the fact that the Sprinter was purchased at a time when we didn't have, its crashworthiness didn't meet the US requirements. And so it is, by the way it's operated, it cannot intermingle with our existing coaster service. It has to be temporarily separated from freight. With this opportunity and the changes in the regulations that someone may have been part of, not going to admit to anything, that changes. And that changes the ballgame, not only for what we're doing here today, but also potential operations for NCTD as a whole, in terms of what we can do to integrate both the Sprinter service and the coaster service, more potential ride opportunities between the two subdivisions, but also potentially, as I talked about before, some operational savings. If we want some midday services but don't have the ridership to justify a whole train set of bi-level cars, we could run an MU instead with some significant operational savings, but still provide the headways that you want for service. So that's part of that as well.
Is it possible that one day the Sprinter equipment and the coaster equipment could totally be the same?
Well, so that's pondering that. So the whole intent is create fleet flexibility is exactly, so a lot of this is going to be within the ridership market. Like, we know we need to have the flexibility, because as Brendan said, Sprinter vehicles, and I think that's an easy interpreted by gives us great operational flexibility if we can operate it at safety. Because then you can break that constant number of trains that are connected to one, or 2, 3, 4, or 5 or more. That gives you great operational flexibility. There are going to still be some times that you're going to want to have bi-level equipment, because the bi-level 750 people that we can move all at one time. It's about market differentiation. And in fact, I would just tell you, probably next month or the month thereafter, I'm going to have an agenda item that will make this real for you all in terms of the steps that we're taking to begin that process of realignment for the future.
Okay, that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you for asking several more of my questions and for answering some that weren't even asked. Director Contreras.
Just a quick question. As we are also looking on the Sprinter side to do some great separation, is there a way to, as we're elevating certain platforms, if that needs to happen, that there could be a move towards the standardization, or that's just not going to work because of, again, the Sprinter that we have?
Well, this is why we're doing this study.
Okay.
So remember, on the Sprinter corridor itself, our next priority is upgrading the signal system.
Right.
To make, to standardize it with the San Diego subdivision. So we have some funding. We're going to be able to do a lot of that work. We already have some design work going on associated with adding double track on the Sprinter, working with the state on as part of the 78 CMCP activities. But these are the things that we have to start looking at and understanding where we can leverage, because it may be somebody else's project that can fund a significant change for us. But it's also then we have to balance with what Member Jenkins said in terms of still got to operate today as we make this transition of technologies. That's why, I mean, every question that you're asking is one of the reasons you got to start doing this type of work in order to be able to answer that question clearly about what is your plan.
Right. Yeah. Just to see how these different timelines intersect with one another. And if we could get that the synergy between these different projects would be excellent. Thank you so much. That was my only question.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Not question, but excellent presentation. Really appreciate this stuff. A long time ago, we looked at merging the Sprinter and the poster locomotive. We determined that was not feasible at the point, but it sure makes sense. The other consideration is San Diego Gas and Electric is going to, as you know, it's getting out of the electrical generation business. So you do need to coordinate with different groups here, unfortunately. There's the San Diego Community Power and then these Energy Alliance. And talking to them also about how they can provide 24/7 service rather than having to have service that is natural gas, whatever. And so the goal of CEA and San Diego CP is to get to the point where it's 100. And right now I know CEA because I'm the chair. We're looking to figure out how to get to the point where 100% electrical long before 2035. So want to be coordinating with electrical.
Oh, yeah. And
this be electrical at some level.
well, and whether it be electrical or hydrogen, they're already having discussions with it. Because the strategy that we had, and I think we have a lot of board members set for the zero emission bonds. We got out ahead because we knew the regulation. And we were able to secure funding infrastructure from SDE for our battery. And we were able to secure money from the California Energy Commission for our hydrogen. So for this rail study, we're going to be out ahead of the industry in terms of substantive. And so the reason that we try to get out ahead is that we will put us in a position to get that or to get operations, because we have a collaboration with SDG&E now on hydrogen along with the party vendor that's looking at how we can have green hydrogen in the region. So totally 100%. We want to search wide and see how many other pockets we can reach into before reaching ours.
All right. Anything else from anyone else? Okay. So you just you mentioned that San Bernardino is close to having a prototype. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Not much. On previous slide, probably can't remember too much. No, it's for a vehicle, hydrogen,
Okay.
basically.
And when might that be online, do you know?
I think it's already on. And so we can coordinate with the like go and take a look at that video. It looks just for the vehicle. But not operate. Not yet. Running past. And they got versions, so they have a dual version. And the same exact brand and hydrogen version. Hydrogen is the prototype. It's